Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a very special edition of Science at Theater, What's Right with Kansas, sponsored by the Friends of Berkeley Lab and co-sponsored by the ClimateWorks Foundation. My name is Jeff Miller. I'm head of public affairs at the lab, and I will be your moderator for the evening. Before we begin tonight's program, I wanted to remind you that we will be back on this stage on November 7th for a panel discussion on the secrets of the soil and the relevance of those secrets to climate change and energy supplies. And with that, I will now slip into my moderator's role and abandon the podium. So, Berkeley Lab in Kansas, a rather strange pairing, I would think, which is probably why some of you are here. But actually, maybe not the real surprise. The biggest surprise tonight is the fact that we'll be talking about climate change without really talking about climate change, at least in the way that we in Berkeley are used to speaking about it. And why does that matter? What's important about that? Well, it turns out that in the race to reduce carbon emissions, there's more than one way to cross the finish line. There are options, ideas, and suggestions that come from all kinds of places. Places like Kansas and places like Berkeley. And while we're speaking of Berkeley, I wanted to talk to you tonight about stereotypes, which we will be confronting. Not the stereotypes that people around the world have about us, but the ones that we might harbor about people in heartland states like Kansas. Now, I know we're all very broad-minded people, and I'm sure that you don't think anything about people in Kansas, no prejudice or anything, but just in case, I want to make sure that you've checked your stereotypes at the door, and if you haven't, if you have to bring them into the audience area right now, please put them under your seats. Just put them there, keep them there for the rest of the evening, because there'll really be no place for them tonight. We're also going to be talking about success. How do you change the conversation when ideologies clash? We're going to be talking about values. Oh, that terrible word, values. It's a code word for some world perspective that we don't really share. But in places like Kansas, values like thrift and conservation really mean something. They're woven tightly into the social fabric. They're not just throwaway words in a fundraising letter. We're also going to be talking about motivation, inspiration, little ideas, and giant ideas. And we're also going to be talking about that most boring of subjects, energy efficiency. I mean, how boring can that be? But actually, it can be fun, it can be engaging, it can be provocative, and maybe even sexy, believe it or not. So you'll see tonight, you guys be the judge. But before we do any of this, we want to show you a video which we shot in Kansas this summer. We hope that it sets the stage for the conversation to follow. It was produced by a Berkeley Lab public affairs team, and tonight is its debut. So we hope you enjoy it, and then I'll be back on stage with our guests following the video.
There's a lot of talk about global warming, and to be honest with you, I almost think that it can be counterproductive, because the phrase global warming brings out so much passion in two different sides.
You mentioned climate change to some people and they just roll their eyes immediately. And why has it got that connotation to it? I think probably because they've heard so many different stories, and so a skepticism grows.
I'm not totally sold on the fact that fossil fuels are actually causing global warming. I think that's up to debate. However, I do believe that there is actual climate change going on. I believe that actually occurs naturally, and that so I'm not as concerned about the global carbon footprint.
So the Climate and Energy Project in Kansas was looking at a population that a lot of other case studies didn't look at, a more conservative state, One that isn't necessarily known for having really developed efficiency programs, but they're moving in that direction. And we're really thinking hard about how do you talk about these issues, about efficiency, changing our behaviors in our homes and in our communities, in a place that, you know, if you say you did it in Kansas, you could probably do it in other places as well. You know, a lot of times we say, oh, they did it in Portland, they did it in Berkeley, and it just doesn't have quite the same resonance.
In Kansas, and I would argue elsewhere throughout the country, climate change became a politically polarized issue. It was seen here early and increasingly since as a liberal issue, as an environmental issue. And people here in the Heartland do not consider themselves either liberal or environmentalists.
You don't start a conversation here with, hey, the reason you got to do this is because of climate change, because it is so politically polarized that it just shuts down the conversation.
One of the things that was really important to the success, I think, of the Climate and Energy Project's approach is that we really meet people where they are. And it's important for us to be thought of as an organization who respects their values, who is honest and open, and it really doesn't matter to us whether they believe in climate change, whether they believe it's human-induced. We're trying to find common ground.
We worked very hard to honor those people's perspectives, to respect their position, and to learn what mattered to them that also mattered to us, so that instead of reframing to make our message more palatable, we were genuinely talking about what mattered to both of us. We were identifying a shared interest and we were pursuing that with everything that we had. So what we thought about was, okay, how do we make genuine, long-term, durable alliances with the particular audiences who are persuasive, who own the narrative in Kansas? And the answer there was fairly clear. The agricultural community, the business community, the faith community were absolutely key to our success.
The wise use of resources has always been things that farmers do. And maybe we can roll that over into how wind energy is also a wise use of the resource. In this case, the wind, it's going to waste otherwise. I guess it seems wasteful to me not to use it. And I would think probably a lot of other landowners see it the same way. So why burn a fossil fuel that we know is eventually going to go away and at the same time let the wind energy just blow by without being utilized. So to be able to go forward and keep that ability for as many generations of Kansans going forward through the economic opportunity that alternative energy provides Kansas, I think that's very important.
Oh, I think it is definitely a heartland value because the land itself here is very precious. In some times in the past we have abused that land. Now we're managing that land and taking convertible products where before we threw them away. And we're managing the land and those resources to convert into many renewable energy resources.
We understand the need to husband our resources and our land for future generations. I mean, a lot of us grew up on the farms here, and we've been taking care of land for a long time. And now we're happy to participate in the wind energy effort that's going on. So this is just a continuation of what I believe are some basic core values in our state.
The leaders of these organizations absolutely became our messengers, and the most compelling example of that, I think, is probably Kansas Interfaith Power and Light.
Interfaith Power and Light is an ecumenical organization that also serves as an advocate both inside and outside of the faith communities. It's not just about Episcopalians, they're not just Christians, it is people of all different denominations and faiths having that conversation across those cultural and religious boundaries about environmental stewardship. And they also serve as both internal advocates within the faith communities and an external advocate in the state as well, pushing for environmental stewardship and talking about it within the context of faith. Because I think there are a lot of people of faith in the state of Kansas. I think it's a big part of our culture. And so being able to have that conversation in the context of God or whatever the religion that we're working in is an important way of getting that message across to the people of Kansas.
I think a lot of people of faith view themselves as, in their part of their faith traditions, as taking care of the place we've been given to live. And so that this is about an environmental stewardship from a faith perspective, that we are to be good stewards of the bounty that we've been given.
We are a military state. We send a lot of young men and women overseas to fight, have done so for generations, are doing so very much now. So there was a real emotional sense that we don't want, and in fact, people wrote in, we don't want to send our boys to be buried in the prairie, we want to have turbines on the prairie.
From my time in the Marine Corps, I've seen people pay the ultimate human cost, as many others have known people, been very tight with people that have paid the ultimate human cost for our military presence wherever we're at in the world. And to some extent or another, our motivations for being over there are tied to our concern to natural resources. When you look at it in that respect, I don't know how anyone could not see energy independence for the United States as a win-win situation.
I think as we look at the country today, that we understand that depending upon resource from abroad for energy is very, very dangerous. I think national policy and strategic policy should wean us away from dependence on energy. The grouping of such things as solar, wind, biomass is a contributing factor to that, and I think technology is on the brink of moving us forward in a dramatic way, particularly in this area of the country.
And we can be the Saudi Arabia of wind. And I believe we have the full capacity to be able to be that, and that can be a key part of what our future is about. At the root of all of this is our need to get off of foreign oil. We have too much dependency that makes us too insecure, that's too expensive for us in that dependency on foreign oil. And harvesting the wind in Kansas and getting it to markets where it's needed around the country is critical.
Came down to the age-old conflict for environmentalists, which is, do you choose economic progress or do you choose to preserve our environment? Our argument from the beginning was you can and should do both.
Our perspective is not so much worrying about whether man causes global warming, but more a matter of why don't we just make improvements that make sense economically, because there's so many of those types of improvements that can be made. Let's address the things that are easy to address first. Make environmental improvements that make sense economically for the frugal-minded Kansans that we are.
For us here in Kansas, particularly with the wind play, jobs was absolutely central. Being able to say that we were going to generate thousands and thousands of jobs that would be long-term, high-earning jobs in exactly the parts of Kansas that have been losing population and losing economic alternatives for generations was absolutely critical.
2009, we found out that Siemens had chosen Reno County and Hutchinson to come to open their nacelle plant. None of us knew what a nacelle was or that it belonged on a wind turbine. So we've been happy to have them here. It's changed a lot of people's lives. A lot of people have jobs that didn't have jobs before. It's just been wonderful for our economy. We needed it. We needed the jobs. And to know that it's renewable energy, simply awesome. We're thrilled. I have people that are walking taller and feeling better about themselves in a long time. So it's helped my business. It's helped our community. So I'm proud to have them here.
Affordable energy and electricity exports will help underpin Kansas's 21st century economy. We'll expand and start new wind energy projects in the state. And if we do this right, we will see the development of a renewable energy corridor throughout the state of Kansas that will provide jobs for rural Kansas and clean energy for the world. I want Kansas to not only be known as the wheat state, but also the renewable state, and we can do it.
One of the things they did really effectively is use competitions between towns to get people engaged and excited.
So the Take Charge Challenge is a competition among 16 cities in Kansas to see who can save the most energy and win a $100,000 energy efficiency or renewable energy grant. It's a competition that features leadership teams in each community working together to try to figure out what strategies they can use to get their friends and neighbors to make small changes in their homes, whether it's change their light bulbs or weatherize their homes or get a home energy audit. All of those things help the community win. It never was about climate change for them. It was about saving money, it was about saving energy, and really about beating their neighbor.
What we do is we are graded on events that you put on, presentations. The people change out energy efficient bulbs and they go on the website, know how many they changed out, and each city is given points. And so right now the city we're in #1 spot, and so we're looking to continue that. And so this is another way for us to go and get the word out to our community.
It was the competition, it was winning. That really mattered. What we did was to refigure energy efficiency from sacrifice to win, and that's a big deal. It's the difference between Jimmy Carter putting on his cardigan and saying you must sacrifice and waving a banner and saying we won, you know, we did this.
What we found is that these behaviors kind of snowball, if you will. And so what we were hoping to do with the Take Charge Challenge is just get people started on those actions and break down those barriers so that it becomes safer to have the conversation because you're already kind of participating in it, and maybe it's not so easy to demonize when you're taking part in the movement.
So part of it starts with programs like in Kansas, where they get interest, there's a competition, they're actually tracking the results over time in terms of the light bulbs installed, the measures taken, the total savings from that town compared to another town. Those sort of metrics are extremely important. They set the stage, I think, for more infrastructure and technology changes. It definitely takes getting people interested, engaged, and motivated to even start to think about making those larger investments, to start thinking about investing $5,000, $10,000 to improve their home, to save efficiency, to save energy.
The Heartland matters in this conversation. There are people here who are doing the right thing for a variety of reasons. It's not about climate change for many of them, but they're still changing their light bulbs, they're still weatherizing their homes, they're still supporting wind energy, they're still doing the right things for the right reasons, for their reasons, and we just have to continue to respect those reasons and continue the conversations in the Heartland.
The work that we need to do on climate change is to, in fact, in real time, reduce carbon emissions. That's what actually matters, and that becomes easier and easier as we have successes along the way in reducing those carbon emissions. That part of our turning away as a nation from action on climate change is the sense that we can't do it. It's too much and it will hurt. We need to work together so that we can do it. And at that point, the conversation about climate change, in our estimation, changes 180 degrees.
Welcome the stars of our video, Merrian Fuller and Nancy Jackson. Please, give them a warm welcome. So, welcome you guys.
Thank you.
I think there are probably going to be a lot of questions from the audience, so we're just going to dive right in. Merrian, I'm going to start with you. Since it did start with you, the driving demand report. So I know that energy efficiency is sometimes called the fifth fuel, the four being oil and coal and nuclear and alternative energy. Was that fact sort of one of the prompts to do the driving demand report? And you should probably explain what that is to those who don't know.
Yeah, so we did a report looking at what actually inspired, motivated people to get involved in energy efficiency programs in the first place. It certainly is the fifth fuel. It's certainly the fuel that allows other ones to not have to be used, so the cheapest and often easiest to get, but it turns out it's not as easy as some people think. And so we wanted to know what programs out there seem to be doing this effectively, making a difference, really engaging people at a broad level. And that was what inspired the report.
It's been downloaded, I think, 400,000 times now.
Right.
Probably, there might be multiple people doing it multiple times, but still a lot of people.
And how many pages is the report again?
Over 100. I'm sure we have some really neat, like, 2-page summaries in the front.
It's not efficient.
But it includes case studies of examples like Nancy's from Kansas and other ones from all over the country that point at least some of the kernels of what is going to work to get this to scale.
So how did you first run across CEP? I'm sure there must have been a lot of choices, a lot of organizations.
I actually met Nancy at a conference last year where we were coming together to talk about how to catalyze the clean energy economy. And I really wanted case studies that weren't just from the coast. And there actually is quite a bit going on in the Heartland. There's a lot of new, interesting energy efficiency programs going on there. But in particular, we wanted examples that really were using motivational techniques, really reaching out to people in new ways, using language that the folks they were trying to reach actually understood, as opposed to kind of the standard, you will save money, energy bill insert in the utility bill,
Is that more likely to happen on the coast than the Heartland to use that?
That happens all over.
Okay.
Utilities tend to do that if they haven't learned already that doesn't work.
Okay. So for those who did not read the New York Times article, which I believe was in October of 2010. Was that about right? About that. So the driving demand report, New York Times reporter saw the report, thought the CEP was an interesting story to do, and then filed this story, which appeared in the New York Times, which first got my interest, although I was aware of the report that Merrian had done. So Nancy, we need to have the elevator speech about CEP. So, you're sitting next to me on a plane and you say you're the board chair for the Climate Energy Project. So what is the Climate Energy Project and what would be its biggest success to date?
The Climate Energy Project was, this is not the elevator speech, but it is relevant.
It's okay. It's a long ride in the elevator.
Okay, good, very tall building. It was born actually of a spirited conversation in the kitchen with my father-in-law, who many of you may know. He's the founder of the Land Institute in Kansas, and he had testified against large proposed coal plants in western Kansas, but he was testifying in Topeka and Lawrence, which are two towns in eastern Kansas, nowhere near where these coal plants were. And so in the kitchen, I proposed that maybe that wasn't the best way to reach the result that he desired, and he said, what would you do? And what I said was, I would demonstrate the viability of the alternatives, that actually energy efficiency and wind energy are both better economically and better environmentally, and that they're a win-win and they make a lot more sense. And that was how the Climate Energy Project started. Our biggest success to date, judging by the New York Times and this evening, is certainly the Take Charge Challenge, although I have to say we are also enormously delighted to see our famously conservative governor, Sam Brownback, stand up and say we are going to be not just the wheat state, but the renewable state.
And really the Saudi Arabia wind, is that possible?
Well, we are the second windiest state in the nation.
We're going to get to that, because we're going to have a little audience participation about which is the windiest state before we finish the segment. So I think now that you've heard a little bit about it, the success of the program and seen the video, we need to show you a little bit of context about the state in which Nancy and her folks work. So we're going to show this. It's sort of hard for me to see, but I'll turn around. So we see a lot of red up there. California considered a blue state. So let's talk about what do people in the audience need to know about Kansas, and what might be some things that would surprise them?
What the audience needs to know is that Kansans are just like you. We just own a lot more land. A lot more. Quite seriously, naturally, Kansans are also raising their children and working in their jobs and hoping for a wonderful future for everyone. And what I think is instructive and important about this slide, just like California's blue slide, is that if you look up there, you see that, of course, the majority voted for McCain in this instance, but 41.4% voted for Obama, right? So that's a minority, but it's not a gigantic minority, and really critical to recognize that there's a significant mix there. In terms of the things that people don't know about Kansas, we were famously known not so long ago for the state school board electing to teach another theory alongside evolution.
No.
Yes. And what's less known, and I think really instructive and important, is that a group of people who had been a part of the conversation with the school board over a long time, continued a very focused study group and proposed science standards for the state of Kansas, which were recognized just recently as among the best in the nation. And so while Kansas is known for, or is believed to be a state that does not believe in evolution, we now have fantastic science standards because a number of people wanted to make sure that that happened. So a lot of both going on there.
So there's a network of small and medium-sized towns all over the state. And I see the states or the counties are kind of configured in that way. So what is it like to be in these small towns? I mean, what are the important institutions? Are churches important?
Churches are very important. Schools are very important. And of course, chambers of commerce, businesses are very important. A lot of Kansas has been losing population for generations, sort of the western half of the state primarily. And so the economic future is of grave concern to all communities everywhere, but certainly to those. So all of those institutions remain critical. We have a lot of Boy Scouts in Kansas. We have very robust church attendance. In many ways, we do hearken back to a different time.
So is it safe to say that most people in Kansas are going to church regularly? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
The majority of Kansans attend church just about weekly.
So Merrian, when you look at this map, does anything jump out at you? Is it the demographics? So when you're considering the other states and other programs that you looked at, is there anything particularly distinctive about Kansas?
I mean, I think everywhere you go, you find a great deal of diversity. If you look at LA County, there's a huge amount of diversity, even though you might assume LA is one way. And that's true all across the state. I mean, we've seen programs where in one neighborhood, they've responded very different to messages and tactics that in another neighborhood went off really well. And I think we learn this again and again, even though it's like easy and nice to be able to say, oh, Kansas is like this. When you actually are on the ground and trying to talk to people and convince them of things, very different people, there's a lot going on. And you actually have to, even within neighborhoods, even with towns, you have to be able to talk to people in a way that they understand. And by working through some of these institutions that already have trust in those communities, that seems to be one of the better ways of actually getting people's attention without spending millions of marketing dollars that most of these programs just don't have.
So CEP is based in Lawrence, which is one of the blue little spots there. So was that a problem for the organization when they went out to the rest of the state? Were you tainted in some fashion? It's like Berkeley in Kansas or something.
Well, yes, okay. In a word. We were part of the Land Institute to begin with, which is based in Salina, but is considered a liberal institution, certainly, within the state of Kansas, and is working on perennial polyculture, which is a different way of doing agriculture. So again, sometimes suspect to our key audiences. And so what we realized early, one of our first sort of notable missteps was we thought, well, if we just we're persuaded by information. Other people will be too. So we distributed the executive summary of the IPCC report.
And how did that go down?
We did it personally. We actually hand-delivered it to everyone in the legislature, and it went down very, very poorly. It was.
Did they even take it? Did they?
They took it and they said, "Who are you and who gave you the money to do this and what is this?" And yeah, it was a bad idea, and so we learned our lesson and thought hard about the fact that, in fact, clearly we were not the most credible messenger for a number of these communities. So we began to think hard about who was and realized that there were all kinds of alliances that we were very well positioned to build. And that's what the work has been about for the last 4.5 years.
Now, I note that transportation is really not one of your platforms. So you want to talk about is there any mass transit in Kansas?
Yes, there's some.
Okay.
But not a great deal. As I mentioned, we own a lot of land out there. We have predominantly rural communities and very dispersed populations, with the exception of a couple of urban centers in Wichita down toward the middle there, and then Kansas City. Every place else is quite notably smaller, and so the opportunities to reduce vehicle miles traveled are quite limited. Really, we saw, in terms of reducing emissions, we saw the real opportunity in the electric sector because we're so heavily dependent on coal. And so the opportunity to dampen demand through increased energy efficiency, and at the same time, as old and a lot of our coal plants are very old. As old plants get ready to retire, if we have wind energy up and ready to replace that, then we can really change that mix and reduce our emissions.
So is changing the automobile mile per gallon rate, is that a big issue in Kansas? Do people say, oh, we don't want more energy efficient vehicles? Or is that a big issue for them? Or,
No, I mean, I think as elsewhere in the nation, when gas prices were high, there was a real move toward smaller vehicles. There's a limitation there because particularly for farm economies, there's a need for traction and there's a need for big trucks. So there's not a resistance to it.
Okay. What the map doesn't show, you mentioned though, you alluded to the western part of the state, sort of the rural depopulation. So can you describe what's going on there? And I think when I remember talking to one of the farmers who mentioned that it's possible if you have a wind turbine on your farm, you can actually earn as much as $30,000 per turbine per year, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but when you think about the farm economy, a guaranteed return of $30,000 times however many you can get on your land is quite a bit. So this has been a huge boon to that part of the country?
It has. And so, you know, in a place that is depopulating and where job choices are scarce, and where farm economies are always really right on the edge, you know, have been for at least a generation, if not two, the opportunity to have this sort of additional crop, this added income for farms is saving grace for a lot of these farmers and ranchers. But in addition to that, those jobs, the technician jobs for wind turbines, are some of the highest earning in a lot of these communities. In addition to the kind of nacelle factory, you know, the manufacturing that we're seeing popping up across the state, which again has higher than average wages and a lot more jobs in small communities than those communities are used to seeing.
So how many people are employed in the wind industry right now in Kansas, do you know?
Well over 1,000 people,
yeah.
And that's as many more thousands have lost their jobs in that same period of time. So wind has been adding jobs at exactly the time when other economies have been flailing.
Okay, well, I said in my introduction that we weren't going to specifically talk about climate change, but that was actually a lie because now I'm going to bring it up. So climate change, skepticism in Kansas, just two kind of go together. And so what do you think is the source of that? And human-induced climate change, because there was a big distinction made between human-induced and we think that the weather is changing. So what is the source for the skepticism, do you think?
Clearly, climate change has become a political marker on both sides of the political equation. And so I wouldn't for a moment dismiss that, but by the same token, I'm not sure that we know what drives skepticism. And I guess I would submit that I'm not sure I'm terribly concerned by that. I think that the atmosphere doesn't really much care what we believe. The atmosphere cares what we emit. And so our principle from the beginning was, let's reduce emissions with things that we can agree on and save the conversation about belief for, you know, as we continue down that road together.
So Merrian, okay, when you look at Kansas, how important is it that a state like Kansas sort of become a residential energy efficiency model?
Well, I mean, Kansas uses a lot of coal. And so in that sense, it matters more what homeowners in Kansas do than what homeowners in Berkeley do by a long shot in terms of emissions.
No, really? More than homeowners in Berkeley?
Yes.
Did you hear that? Homeowners in Berkeley? The people in Kansas are
They matter more. But beyond that, to me, this question of whether or not folks believe in climate change is really important. I get really worried when we think it's enough that people are motivated just by saving money. And then some people say, well, you have to get to climate change if you want to solve the real problem. It can't just be about saving money, right? That's often the argument. We can't just stop there. I do get really nervous when we stop at, you're going to save money, that's all we're selling you. But what I find promising about what you guys are doing in Kansas and by what some of the folks here are saying is that there's actually deeper fundamental values that people are tapping into to motivate action beyond just the dollars and cents, right? So the average utility bill in the country is like $150. And you know, tell someone, oh, you're going to save a third of that. It's like $50 a month. And a lot of people are not going to, you know, stay home to get the insulation contractor into their house, to do the work, to, you know, pay a couple $1,000s to have insulation and air sealing so that they can stop, you know, wasting energy every day. But if it's a part of a larger conversation that, we believe in conservation, we believe in doing a practical right thing by our resources and by our land, that's what I like need to have hope about the whole country actually getting on board and making change. They don't have to believe that people are causing climate change, I don't think, but they have to have some moral basis for action beyond just saving money.
And do you think that exists across the country in some fashion?
I think we see it in this video. I definitely think, the seeds are there. Mm-hmm. Connecting those seeds to actions in our communities is what Nancy and others are trying to do. Getting that conversation started, getting this to be a normal, positive thing that communities just, it's something we think about.
Well, I was struck when we were there about this relationship between the word conservative and conservation. That came up a lot, and I didn't, that's not really the context in which I'm used to hearing it. So is there something particular about those two words in Kansas that means something significant to folks?
Well, I think we've been trying to say, let's put the conserve back into conservative. By definition, what conservatives do is conserve, whether that's money, whether that's options, whether that's environmental resources. And so I do think that there is a deep, you heard it from several people in the video who were not environmentalists and would never define themselves that way. Nevertheless, they all are operating, whether from a spiritual sense of stewardship or just the Boy Scout principle of let's leave this place as good as we found it, that there really is that value that is deep.
And you do see people out of the country connected to land in a different way than people in cities, for example, might be connected to it. And I think that can be motivating. I've been in conversations with folks in the Midwest and also just airplane rides, across the country, and I've actually heard people talk about how important it is that their kids get outside and actually experience the land. And that can easily be connected to a whole series of actions and choices that folks make.
So you're seeing that across in lots of states where the people are closer to the land doing agriculture.
I see the potential for that to be there. I see that the values are there. You don't have to create the values in people, but you do have to connect them to a set of actions that they might not currently think about or know about or
And I wonder if I could amplify on that a little bit, because I think there is often a sense that if we start with belief, and then that will lead to action. Mm-hmm. But we know that that's not always true, because certainly many people know perfectly well that smoking is bad for them, but continue to smoke. They know that they shouldn't be, that they should be exercising, they should be watching their diet, and yet they're obese. And so belief doesn't always lead to action, and what we're finding is that actually the inverse can be true. That if what you do is to work with the community on the actions they can take, that, as Eileen said on the video, taking those actions together can actually move the entire community to a place where they can have a different conversation about what they know. And so we've actually tried to invert that and say, let's act first and continue to have a conversation as we go.
Yeah, and the research actually really supports this, right? Yeah. So you see social psychology research basically saying if you can get people to take small steps, they'll start to see themselves as a person who recycles, as a person
you work at Berkeley Lab, you're talking about social psychology research. The two don't equate.
Well, it turns out to solve some of the problems that are important, you also need to understand human beings. And so,
really?
Yes. Yes, and so we do look at things like that because it matters in actually the deployment of these technologies that we want to see in the field. And so things like this, little steps, and maybe it takes a competition, competing against a rival town to get people to try something once, and then it becomes normal. And that's another huge theme that you see in these programs. You have to use social norms. People have to think that this is the normal, practical thing to do. It can't be, I sometimes worry there are places that have campaigns that show energy efficiency programs as superheroes. If you participate in this program, you're a superhero. Yeah. Well, that's the message of that person's abnormal, they have special powers. It's not something the normal person can do. And that might work in places that, I'm not gonna name names. Okay. There are programs that use that though. And I think that in many places, people are gonna say, I'm not that person. I don't have time to be a superhero. And it needs to be something that's a practical, normal thing to do. And what we find in the research is that for things as simple, that there's a lot of literature that looks at messages that you give. People will say they do it for environmental reasons, but they actually do it because they've been told that other people do it too. Over and over again, you see this. There's legendary study where there's a sign in a hotel room and it says, save water don't, reuse your towels. Don't put them on the floor, and we'll leave them for you to reuse. And one's a save water message. Another one is, this creates X number of pollution into the atmosphere if you, various messages.
Yeah.
One environmental, one, be a good person. Another one is that the person who stayed in this room for 90% of the people who stayed in this very room, reuse their towel.
And that's the one that works.
That's the one that works.
Is that also
but when you ask people why, they will not tell you that. And that's something that's very tricky. You can't just ask people what's motivating. They don't always know, and it's mostly that they don't always know. I don't know if it's always that they don't want to admit it, but it's this subconscious sort of motivator.
Is it the same principle when people in a neighborhood know what their neighbors are using energy that they also?
Yes, and there's been a lot of experiments with that too.
Competition.
Yep.
I want to go back to the land thing for just a second. So let's just say that proximity to the land is an important value that really helps. How about people in urban areas who don't have that? So what would be the comparable version of that here?
Well, there's certainly places that have an environmental ethic that already exists in many cities. Berkeley certainly has that, and lots of people, I'm sure, get out to Tilden Park and places really close by.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that just this, I'm sure even in cities in Kansas, there's not a lot of large cities, but I'm sure even there's a fundamental value of conserving resources, at least in a broad sense. So and I don't think you can generalize either. It's not going to be one thing in each place. In Chicago, they're connected to the land in certain ways, even though they're in a large city. But they also have, a huge climate action plan that's motivating a lot of the city agencies to incent certain types of action. So it's always like a super complex mix of things that are actually going to motivate that individual person or business owner that you might be trying to approach.
But peer pressure definitely helps with everyone.
Yeah.
That's true.
It does.
It does for so many things.
It does.
Yeah.
Again, another thing that struck me when we were in Kansas was there was a lot of respect for science, even though we disagreed with it. So I wonder now when I hear what you're talking about, the changes in the school science norms, they had a respect for it, which I was a little surprised by. They made this distinction. So is that true? I mean, do you find, were people just being polite, or did they actually believe that?
We are really polite.
You are very polite, yes.
So polite. So yes, they were being polite, but it is also true. They were, but it is also true that Kansans, again, really almost everyone in Kansas is only one generation removed from the farm if they are off the farm, and crop science has and animal husbandry. Almost every family in Kansas has directly experienced the results of science in their lives, and so I think that there's a healthy respect, certainly for technology and for science as well. As you heard one of the gentlemen in the video say, I think that there are just a lot of competing messages in sort of the public dialogue right now, and it's difficult for non-scientists to sift through them.
Okay, we're going to move off this slide to this slide. We saw a lot of American flags flying from front porches in Kansas, so I know that Kansas consider themselves patriotic, but is there also some connection to the huge role that the military plays in the state? And I know the military, actually, in terms of energy independence, this is also one of the themes that we saw in the video and that other people talked about as well.
No, it is, and I think, as you saw in the video, there are several forts in Kansas. Fort Riley is the home of the Big Red One that was famous in the first Gulf War. Fort Leavenworth is where a lot of international officers are trained. We have a huge economic dependence on the military in Kansas, but also really almost every family has one, if not multiple members of the family who have served, and many of whom have died. And so we did get, in response to a blog post at one point about the military and what the military has been doing to achieve better energy efficiency and the use of renewable resources. There were a lot of people who responded, as I said in the video, one woman in particular who said, I think it just makes a lot more sense to put turbines on our planes rather than bury our young men and women under them. And that was just a theme that we saw over and over. There really is a visceral sense that we ought not to be overseas dying to get resources that perhaps we could replace better here.
So, Merrian, the military's interest in energy efficiency, has that played into any of your reports so far? And
We haven't seen it as much in the kind of the residential market that we looked at, but we do know that the military, all branches of the military have been amazingly receptive to renewables and efficiency. And the good thing about the military is that one person makes a decision and it happens. So way more easy than working with like convincing people of these things.
You mean like
one
working
by
at
one.
the lab, trying to get something done at the lab, that kind of
But literally, they're just very effective, and they see the value proposition in it, and they also see the casualties on the ground of getting oil and other resources to battlefields. Right. Hugely expensive, hugely dangerous in terms of the number of lives lost. So for them, it's been a really easy equation. I mean, compared to any other institution that I know of in the world, certainly in the United States, they have really gotten the bug for renewables and efficiency.
Agreed. And having that example in front of Kansans, certainly, and I would say people across the Heartland, is enormously persuasive.
So do Kansans feel a special sense of pride in their history? I mean, they've had a history of a lot of progressive and radicalism, and they have then became known for something else. But do they feel like maybe they're misunderstood by the sort of coastal elites? Does that term come up at all?
I hate to speak for Kansans.
Well, I know you're from California originally.
I am.
You were born in Aptos, right?
I was.
Yes, okay.
Don't let that get around. You edit that out.
Oh, sorry. We'll edit that out.
No, I am a convert, though. You know, I've lived in Kansas for over 15 years and really do love it there. And I do think there is a sense that I remember when I was starting the Climate and Energy Project, my husband and I were watching a segment of Bill Maher, and the election had just happened. George W. Bush had been elected for the second time, and Bill Maher was saying to, I think it's Susan Sarandon, what happened? And she said, I don't know, I think people in the middle of the country are stupid. And and we took personal offense at that. And I think to the extent that people in the middle of the country feel misunderstood, it's probably in that sense that, you know, people in the middle of the country naturally, you know, are not stupid. They are in a really different context and have a very different tradition and a different context in which they're operating now. So I don't know that I could say if they feel misunderstood, but I often feel they are misunderstood.
So what was the biggest surprise when you, from California, moved to Kansas? What some things you had to get used to? I'm just trying to establish a context here so people can understand.
People in Kansas speak more slowly than I do. So I stood out that way and are less expressive with their faces. I was horrified to watch myself on the video. They're much more controlled and have a better appearance in that way. I do think, I mean, communities are stronger. You know, we have a smaller population in the state. We still have a lot of smaller towns. People really know one another. One of the things that's been the most impressive to me as a transplant is that in Kansas, it's not 6 degrees of separation. It's really 1. I mean, really almost anybody in the state that you want to get to and have an important conversation, you can find a way to do that. You know, including the governor, who is incredibly approachable and available. And so for an organization like ours, that was an incredible boon that we had these working networks that we could plug into and that were very welcoming to us despite the fact that our name was the Climate and Energy Project and most of them didn't agree with our premise. So.
Okay, let's take a look at the energy landscape in Kansas. So, Merrian, is this fairly typical of the states in the middle of the country?
Yeah, and the Southeast and a lot of other places.
A lot of other places.
Yeah.
So there's a heavy reliance on coal, and I'm wondering, were most Kansans, I mean, are they aware that the coal is the primary source?
They are now, because it was so controversial for a good 3 years, dominated legislative sessions and so on. But when we started our work, we did a lot of public opinion research, and what we found in focus groups and in polling is that a lot of Kansans thought that the majority of their electricity came from the sun, from solar, and from hydro.
Really?
Which is not true.
Radically different, the reality. So the 2030 goals, there's still a lot of coal up there. Is that, can you anticipate it being more ambitious perhaps, or is that wildly, overly ambitious at this point?
That's pretty ambitious, and when we were first showing this slide, what we were trying to show was that it was reasonable and it was achievable, that it wasn't absolutely crazy. We weren't saying shut down all of your coal plants. What we were proposing really was, as some of these aged plants get to the end of their useful life, let's retire them and replace them with native resources that can help Kansans to thrive over time. It's an ambitious goal. We're doing well. We've got 7% of Kansas energy is generated by wind now, which is a dramatic difference from that first slide just a few years ago. We have a long way to go on efficiency.
But it's also important to think, I mean, is coal going to be an issue that folks in Kansas are really going to get that upset about? As, you know, it's cheap. I don't know. It's been cheap anyway. It's actually getting more expensive, so there's that's good. But you know, it's an American resource. So there's certain arguments that, you know, aren't going to move people the way we might in Berkeley hope they would. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of places that, you know, for the last many years, for as long as I can remember, have depended on cheap coal to keep prices low.
And this is an important point that Merrian's making, because our electricity costs are remarkably low even still, and they've gone up dramatically in recent years. When we started work, retail rates were on the utility that I get my service from 8 cents a kilowatt hour.
Compared to here where it's like 12 to 40, I think now, around 40.
Yeah, I mean, it was remarkably inexpensive. Yeah. So yes, coal was cheap over time, but in addition to that, we were a coal state at one time. Kansas has coal. We have a lot of oil and gas. We develop it still. So you're right. It's a state that's very friendly to that kind of resource extraction. And so, again, that was a question of how do we begin talking about this in a different way. And what we chose was, at this point in time, coal is coming from somewhere that's not Kansas. And so both for energy independence reasons, but also for just economic viability, resilience reasons, it makes more sense to make use of a local resource that has the fuel itself has a cost basis of 0.
Yeah, right. And in many, you know, Midwestern states, some Western and Eastern and Southeast, there's going to be a lot of coal plants retiring, and building new ones is going to be quite expensive. So there are opportunities now to even start making economic arguments that as those are phased out due to both Clean Air Act and just that they're 40 plus years old, there may be opportunities to say, you know, as we're thinking about replacing it, what are we going to replace it with?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we have been receiving some questions in social media for this event, so this is a little off topic, but I'm going to ask it in any case. So someone wanted to know how big CEP is, how big your organization is, where does your budget come from, and then would you ever take money from the Koch brothers if it was offered?
At our height, the Climate and Energy Project was 5 people. And so we are very tiny and mighty, nimble and quick. The majority of our funding over time has come from charitable foundations, Rockefeller Brothers Energy Foundation here in San Francisco, and many others. Recently, the last couple of years, we've been very lucky to have U.S. Department of Energy funding through the National Renewable Energy Labs, and also ERA dollars through the state of Kansas, the Efficiency Block Grant. So that was what really ran the second round of the Take Charge Challenge. And as far as the Koch brothers, they have not called us to offer us money, and I wouldn't anticipate that occurring, but I will say that we have very gratefully accepted sponsorships from utilities and from wind producers and from Walmart. And so, you know, if the question goes to the purity of money, I would submit that it's pretty hard to find clean green out there, really. You know, Rockefeller Brothers is one of our big supporters. We're intensely grateful to both the family and the foundation, but that fortune was made on resources that were extracted.
So do you see a similar pattern for other energy organizations across the country?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting stage right now where we've had billions of stimulus dollars pouring into programs like this all over the country. Really interesting, you know, creative experiments going on around what works, how do you reach people, really great research to figure out how do you segment the markets, those sorts of things, creative ways of incenting folks. And we really see a huge wall, or cliff rather, in the next year as those funds run out, and you know, people are scrambling to find funding. Probably the most reliable source of funding in the country has really been utility ratepayer funds. So those little charges that in some states, and actually many states, they take little bits of money off your bill and they use it to fund efficiency, and in some cases renewables. We spend billions of dollars every year, or not billions every year, but billions over several years in California here for our efficiency programs. And We actually just are about to release a report looking at over the next 10 years, what do we expect that money to do? And it goes up gradually, but part of the problem is that it's unevenly distributed throughout the country, and it's not necessarily distributed in states with the most potential for carbon savings. But that is going to be the most reliable and resilient source of funds that we see going forward, given the current political climate and the current lack of funding this sort of work at a federal and often state
Is there
level.
not a story about this funding in California at the moment?
In terms of the ratepayer funds?
Yes, ratepayer funds.
Would you like me to tell that story?
Maybe a little bit of it.
What's happened most recently is that the utility charge, the public goods charge that is on our utility bills, was not renewed by the legislature, and it expires at the end of this year. In California, though, we mostly get our efficiency funds through a procurement process. That's kind of an arcane thing that no one here probably cares that much about. And so we're going to be able to continue to get most of our money through that mechanism. And we'll see what happens in the legislature next year in terms of renewing some of our very important resources for R&D and research that were part of that fund,
Okay.
public goods fund.
So now we're going to pause for a second for a little audience response time. You heard Nancy mention earlier that Kansas is the second windiest state. So our friends at NREL, National Renewable Energy Research Laboratory, have done a measurement of the windiest states in the US. So we all agree that Kansas is second, but I'm going to read you the list of the other 4, and by your applause, you're going to tell me, you can only applaud once, please, which is the windiest state. So I'm just going to read the choices first, and then we'll go through them again. So the choices for the windiest state, and I'm not sure how you actually do that. I mean, does the wind stop at the border? I don't know how they do that. Nebraska is one. North Dakota is another. Montana and Texas. So think about that for like 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we will start with North Dakota. Applaud for North Dakota. Okay, Montana. Definitely weak for Montana. Texas. Nebraska. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that Texas actually is the windiest state, and I think Nebraska may have won here, but it was close. It was close. What's that? No, it is not actually. It is not. So let's switch now to a series of slides that Merrian has provided about, these are various advertisements from some of the other energy efficiency programs. We're going to kind of move into the behavior change topic now. How do you actually get people to change their behavior? So we're just going to run through these. What can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so this is an ad from Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, and they were really looking at a message of, this is a conservative value your grandpa would approve. It just makes sense, like don't be an idiot, like your grandpa knows about this sort of message. And they really wanted to make this seem practical, and even though it's Boulder, Colorado, which a lot of places, people probably think, oh, hippie crazies as well, like Berkeley, there's a lot of very practical, down-to-earth folks there. And
really?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And so this sort of like practical thing, don't get left out. There's all these rebates, $1,000 worth of rebates, et cetera. And it ends at a certain date. That's another thing that programs has found, that there needs to be some sort of deadline to actually motivate action.
All right, let's take the next one here.
This is an example from Eagle County, which is where Vail and other big ski resorts are. So they're really tapping into the local culture there. They told me that a number of these actually have the picture of one of the bachelors. I can't remember, I can't remember his name. I'm so out of pop culture. But anyway, a guy there who was like famous from The Bachelor is now like featured in these ski pass ads, who's like well known, a local advocate for this. So they're using like a local celebrity, someone people recognize, with like, oh, exciting, fun, it's winter, like let's go skiing. No, it's winter, you actually need to make sure your home is insulated well, is kind of the connection there.
Okay.
So this is an example of just a case study. What we find is that people really need to have models that they recognize. They want other people to go first. They want to see that someone that they can relate to has actually done what they're thinking of doing. Most people, probably 85% of people or more, aren't the early adopters, don't want to go first, want to make sure that someone else has tried it and it's tried and true. So this is a series of of success stories from Charlottesville, Virginia, and it really just, each one, there's more detail behind this, but they're mostly focusing in their advertising on families that are actually community members who went through the program, the level of savings, information about their home, so that people can start to get familiar with this with someone that they recognize.
Okay.
This is a lot of programs actually do this, where they have a lawn sign in front of every home that they do an upgrade to. So you can start to see within a neighborhood, let's say you do a neighborhood sweep through the community, and you start, every other house starts having these lawn signs, and people who don't have them start feeling weird, like, I didn't participate, what's wrong with me? That's definitely a good thing to encourage in a community if you want people to participate. They want to feel like something's wrong with them if they don't participate. So this is an example. Every home makes an impact. Go to the website, get involved now. Very important message.
Okay. One of my favorites.
Oh, it's not going.
It's not going? There we go. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So this is an ad from the Southeast. The Southeast Energy Alliance put these together, and the idea is that there's an elephant in the room that no one's talking about. You're in your home, you're cold, or you're really hot, and no one just wants to mention that. And that this is something that should actually be brought out into the open, is worth talking about, and clearly they use a creative visual image to get that across.
Okay. Next.
This is actually a program that's going to be launching in Alameda County in Oakland, and it's going through kids to get their parents to sign up for programs. This has been done for a lot of different issues. Recycling is probably the one that's most commonly known, where it was actually kids that started to nag their parents to recycle, and that's why a lot of people all across the US started recycling. They had very targeted programs at schools. This is a similar thing, that if you get a certain number of parents in each school to sign up, they are entered in a raffle, and the school can win. They both get money per parent that signs up for educational purposes, and they get entered in a raffle that they can win $10,000 if they are the school with the most parent participants in the district.
We are actually starting our own program, not with $10,000 prizes, but something called Cool Your School, a pilot program, which you'll all be hearing more about in the spring. Okay, next.
This is from Connecticut. They're doing something similar to Kansas, where they're trying to get cities and towns to compete against each other. And similar to Kansas, they have different points for different activities that both the town can take, that the local individual business owners and homeowners can take, and they compete. And they have these, the scoreboard that's constantly online. They show it in a bunch of different venues in each town, and they compete for prizes. And I think some of the prizes include things like you can get solar or efficiency in your municipal building. You get, there's been other programs that try to motivate people, for example, by if a community does a certain amount of energy savings, you actually get a park that everyone wanted in the kind of a central location. Things like that are really tangible, unlike efficiency, which tends to not be tangible. It's the lack of something. Trying to get people to actually relate it to something physical, something that they want, and ideally something that the community can work together to work towards and actually accomplish together.
Great. Okay, so now, oops. Let's talk about the Take Charge Challenge in Kansas. And before we get to that, though, you mentioned that some of the things that you obviously a big success. I mean, you mentioned some things you did wrong at the beginning. Were there other things that you did wrong? Because there might be some other folks here in the audience who are thinking about taking some steps and trying to start their own environmental organization or do some bootstrap work. Are there other lessons here? We're going to talk about that at the end, but I'm curious at the very beginning if there were some things you absolutely would not do.
I think the biggest of those really was just not paying attention to who our audience was and what they already thought and believed, and which is remarkable because, as I said, we did a lot of public opinion research, so we really should have known better. And there were a number of missteps early on that score. With the Take Charge Challenge, I would say early too, when you're bootstrapping, we did the first round of the Take Charge Challenge with $150,000. That was the total amount that we spent, including our staff time. So it was remarkably creative. And in doing that, then, what you want to do is make sure that you're making it as easy on the communities as possible. And one of the things that I would say we did differently in the second round was the first time our volunteers were so excited, and they were just wanting to create all these wonderful events to launch the challenge and to do quarterly celebrations and so on. And we realized that people really weren't willing to come out for whole new events that they'd never heard of for a program that didn't yet matter to them. And so the second round, we really got smarter. And again, it's similar to just knowing your audience. We got smarter about piggybacking onto events that were already occurring and working with groups that were already established so that there was less of reinventing the wheel that was going on.
So I know this second Take Charge Challenge has a $100,000 prize.
It does.
So is there going to be a third Take Charge Challenge, and will there be money? And if there isn't money, will you get the same kind of participation as you did now?
That's a good question. Again, the first round was a much tinier prize. It was a $10,000 prize, and the winning community ended up putting solar panels on their library, which was a wonderful visible marker for the win. This version, because it was Era dollars, is a lot richer, and the communities are very excited about it. Could I ask Dorothy Barnett to just wave at the audience? I can't see where she is.
Yes, please, Dorothy, wave.
So Dorothy Barnett is our executive director, and she ran both rounds of the Take Charge Challenge. So while I'm up here talking about it, she's the one that deserves all of the credit. But we were talking this evening about the prize and whether it matters and how much it matters. And what I would say that at the end of the day, it's winning that matters. There needs to be a marker for that, similar to the yard sign. It doesn't necessarily have to be a gigantic sum of money. I mean, the communities are thrilled, but I'm not sure any of them are competing harder than the original round of communities that were competing for a measly little $10,000 prize. So winning matters, and a marker matters. The size of the prize, not so much.
So did you choose towns that were, let's say, football rivals?
The first time we did not. The first time, there's another thing that we could have done better. The first time we had our own reasons for choosing the towns that we did, and they were, we wanted to work with every different kind of utility. We didn't want anybody to be able to say, well, sure, it works in California or Portland or New York, but it won't work here. So we wanted to work in rural communities, way out west. We wanted to work in larger communities that are, a bedroom community to Kansas City. We wanted to work with big investor-owned utilities and rural electric cooperatives and municipals. So we had our own metrics for choosing those towns. And they certainly did compete, and they competed very hard. But what we realized was it would be so much easier if we just chose towns that were already competitive. So if they all play against one another in sports, there's an inherent desire to win, to beat that town. And that's what we've seen this time. This time when we chose the groups of towns, we chose towns that play against one another in league sports, and it was tremendously successful.
And so this is like a screen capture, so you're showing the current standings, people see where they are, and how important is that? And Merrian, is this like when you see the behavioral change, so this is a feedback that people like to see?
Yeah, they definitely need to see feedback about how they're doing. And part of that is, you having folks write in how many light bulbs, all the actions that they're taking. They need to know that it's fair and that it's being measured against something, and that they'll be able to tell if they win.
Right.
Similar to the utility bills where you're compared against your neighbor, or you make a change and you actually have a bill that shows you over time your change and you can see it go down. Definitely important to encouraging future actions for their interest.
And how do you make this fun? I mean, really, energy efficiency, how can that be fun?
So one of the things that people said to us at the beginning when we were creating this project was they said, you environmentalists, you're always moving the goalpost. Just when we do the one thing that you said to do, you're telling us that we need to do something more. It was. And so what we decided was, okay, so let's celebrate success as we go. Let's really take a moment to stop and say, great job. Here's what we did it together, and now we're going to do this together, and you, the community, have chosen what you're doing next. That was huge, cool. Giving the leadership teams complete ownership over what they were doing and when they were doing it. But that's how we made it fun. It was every quarter's challenge was kicked off with the big community party and then celebrated at the beginning of the next quarter, and another one kicked off. And some of these were incredibly inventive. One in the most recent challenge was Fight the Energy Hog Day, and there was a pig roast.
Oh yeah, and let's show this. This is like this is one of my favorite. The Soviet art from the Lawrence Fire Department. I mean, look at this. This is amazing.
It was great. And I mean, the firefighters, it was interesting because a lot of people poo-pooed this and they said, oh, they're not going to get on board with that. They don't care. These guys are fierce competitors. And I mean, they are reading by windows. They are, they turn their thermostats way up and swear that they got used to it and they're never going to go back down as low as they were before.
How can you help crush the competition?
Yes, absolutely.
There it is, right there. Yeah. So the link between energy efficiency, renewable energy, and jobs, I mean, how did you make that leap for everyone? I mean, that you could have been just in, let's, be energy efficient, and you not necessarily made that connection to renewable and jobs. So was that a conscious thing that you did from the very beginning, or something that you learned along the way?
Really, the work that we did on wind energy preceded the Take Charge Challenge, so really we applied a lot of the lessons that we learned in that to efficiency. And for wind, jobs is really your winning point. And we were lucky enough, we brought the American Wind Energy Association in. Dorothy arranged an economic development tour, so they addressed large groups of economic development professionals, chamber people, legislators across the wind belt in Kansas. And we got wonderful press response to that. We had booths at the state fair talking about jobs, talking about the manufacturing sector. We had union guys there to talk about those opportunities, as well as business owners. So we recognized early with wind that clearly that was the winner. And when we moved over to energy efficiency, while most of the message was about you can save energy, you can save money, you can make changes that help us to have a more resilient energy future in general in Kansas, we also knew that local economic resilience mattered. And so one of the interesting features of these challenges was every single community chose very intentionally to try to spend most of their money in town with local merchants. And so there really was this sense that local insulators and local sellers of furnaces and air conditioners and so on were going to benefit from this. And they've seen that benefit. And I think now we have that anecdotal evidence, even if it's not as data-driven as we would like.
So is wind at all, is wind at all controversial in Kansas? I mean, in some places here, Green Mountains, Vermont, places in the East Coast, wind turbines, I can't think of anything worse than that. Right. But in Kansas, yes, no?
Some places, yes. So we have an area in Kansas called the Flint Hills. Most of you wouldn't necessarily recognize them as hills, but they're very pretty, and they are extremely scenic, and they are a heritage area for the state. Certainly attract tourists, and so that's a place where there are a number of ranchers who have thousands and thousands of acres and would really prefer not to have turbines. Governor Sebelius, when she was in office, set aside a no development zone for wind in the Flint Hills. Governor Brownback enlarged that. However, the Flint Hills are a tiny slice of Kansas, and the huge western part of the state where the wind is the best is a place where turbines are welcomed. That's economic development that's very much wanted in those areas. And so we just had an announcement today of the biggest wind farm in Kansas that's about to begin to be built down in a couple of counties who have suffered a lot of depopulation over the years. Both of those two counties will receive $500,000 a year from this wind farm, which in California sounds like very little, but let me tell you, that really builds schools and preserves roads and so on. It's an enormous boost to these counties' economies. So,
right. So now we have our wind turbine lapel pins. I'd like to get one.
I mean, just in general, the jobs argument has been a huge part of the stimulus money that's gone into efficiency programs. So we're seeing a lot more jobs per dollar spent for efficiency than renewables even, and certainly more than the fossil fuel economy. If you think of all the labor that it takes to do some of these improvements to buildings and homes, it's a lot of human labor that actually has to be there on site, and is usually a local company, especially for these residential upgrades.
Well, one of the first things that when I read the story about your organization that struck me as clever, and maybe clever isn't exactly the right word, but the fact that in not talking about climate change and wanting to engage with the faith community in Kansas, you use this concept of creation care and Christian stewardship. So, I mean, it's true that you actually even wrote green message points for sermons. Is that a true story?
That's not a true story.
Oh, okay. It's not a true story.
No, we would never presume to write green message points. But what we did, and we cannot take credit because we were inspired by and a part of Interfaith Power and Light, which was started here in the Bay Area and is a national organization. And we started a Kansas chapter of Interfaith Power and Light. What we did do was to provide lots of support to clergy who were wanting to provide messages. And what they did was not only make great use of Interfaith Power and Light's wonderful materials and support, but also a number of them, you saw some of the pictures, the Catholic bishop for most of western Kansas and part of Nebraska hosted, the diocese hosted a day for clergy from many faiths to come together and really talk about how can we talk about this message? What can we say? What have you done? What could we do? And From that then flowed a training for facilities managers so that sanctuaries would pursue improvements. And then from that flowed cool congregations training, which again was supported by IPL nationally. But so we had wonderful materials to work with, but that was outreach to congregants in terms of, okay, so here at the sanctuary, we've made these changes because we want to preserve creation, and we want to encourage you to go home and do similar kinds of things. And so it's been a remarkable experience, and we can't take credit for most of it. We just convened.
Was there any resistance to this at all within the state, like on these environmental ministers, or no? Okay.
We see this in other places too. I mean, I did a bunch of interviews with folks from faith communities in Cincinnati, where they had engaged basically all the large churches in the area to be a part of their stimulus-funded program. And they would choose one church, and they would, or synagogue. There's a lot of different faiths that were involved, and they would do an upgrade on that facility, make it much more efficient, and they would use that as a model to educate the congregation, and then they'd also bring all the other congregations of that faith to that one place to learn about how they did it. And in a number of places, they're actually using their own funds. They have loan pools in many cases to fund various types of repairs and improvements, and they're starting to use some of their own funds to do these upgrades in many of their buildings across, in this case, Cincinnati and that whole region.
So this is not essentially a Christian message. It resonates across other faiths. So there are you see other examples of this in these various communities?
Absolutely.
Okay. Utilities. We're talking about wind not being popular. Utilities are sometimes vilified, and in your case, they almost seem heroic. So how did that happen?
That was by design, in a sense. I mean, we really felt like if we could work with every different kind of utility and show how great they could be in partnering with consumers to reduce energy use, that we knew that they would be heroes to their customers, and certainly they would be to us. And we thought that if we could just applaud loud and long enough, that that would become the new normal. Yeah. And indeed, I think that has proven to be the case. And so we did have terrific partnership with every different kind of utility. The municipal utilities actually created a whole new efficiency program so that their communities could compete. And so they were great partners, and they are, in Kansas, really our best hope of keeping these programs alive over time. This is where it gets institutionalized, and this is where the new normal lives. And so to the extent that utilities can be perceived as energy service providers, and part of that service is helping you use less, then we all succeed. So yes, they were heroes.
Really important, because there's a lot of places in the country where there's been antagonistic relationships that have been developed over time. And because utilities are closely involved with their customers, they have access to all that data that you actually need to know to see if you want to see change over time. It's so important to start there. And I know, for example, these really small utilities in Kansas, like Midwest Energy, they actually have some of the more innovative programs in the country. I'm constantly talking about some small utilities who have just decided that it makes sense to offer basically 0% financing on bill, so that customers over time are paying off improvements to their home. And in one case in Kansas, they actually transfer to the next customer if that person leaves. They do a really good job at making sure that they're going to save money. They have their own staff that goes in there and does a really good quality assurance. But it's been really hard to get other utilities to be that innovative. But in a small place, they can actually test a concept out, and then we can spread it around and show that it actually works in some of the large utilities that sometimes are more risk averse.
Another question that came in from social media is about whether the CEP benefited from the recession, the fact that people would want to save money, and so that was a receptive message that you might not have should the economy turn around.
Yes, I mean, to some extent, we got a little lucky with timing, because just as we were beginning to launch the Take Charge Challenge, the first round was when we were having an economic collapse. And so it was certainly a time when that money-saving message was resonant. What was exciting to us, though, as Miriam noted, is that it became clear as we proceeded that there were so many other reasons that these communities were participating and that they wanted to win, but that using less makes sense. Using less makes sense. And as we continued to talk about that, that message grew actually in resonance rather than the other way around. So it was exciting.
Okay, so let's crystallize this. So for both of you, what is the key to behavior change in this area? What do you think?
the key?
Maybe there's more than that.
Well, there's not one thing. That's what we learn over and over again.
Okay.
I would say that we have to find some way of getting people's attention. And that takes being very creative and actually understanding how people's minds work. Ultimately, I don't think it can just be about it being fun or easy. It needs to be just normal. It needs to be something that everyone does, because we don't have, we're not Coca-Cola with millions and millions of dollars worth of marketing budget. We have to be able to get people engaged, get people interested. In places like Kansas, where they might find it off-putting at first if it's associated with climate change, get people actually to do something and to start them see themselves as someone who does things like this, conserving energy. And then it needs to start to be just part of what we do as homeowners, as business owners, as people who are taking care of the infrastructure in this country. It needs to start to be normal, and actually not exciting and sexy ultimately.
Not exciting and sexy?
No, but
really?
ultimately,
No, surely not.
But in the beginning, you have to catch people's attention.
Okay. Right. In the beginning, there has to be an event. There has to be a moment of decision where you get to the new normal. And for that to happen, there has to be a disruption in what you've been doing. And so for us, certainly, I think success has been based on making it local, really knowing the audience. As Miriam said, there are different neighborhoods that respond differently, much less different towns, different states, and so on. So making it local, making it relatively easy, and making it fun absolutely matters at first. If you want to have that disruptive moment where you reset your defaults, that has to happen. But you're exactly right, and the recycling is the perfect example, right? It was largely kids in schools that came home and said, we have to recycle, and the blue bin out there that makes you embarrassed if you don't have the blue bin, to the point that now recycling is a norm, and it's embarrassing if you don't do it.
Exactly.
This is exactly what we're going for. So I would agree. Long term, it needs to be the norm, but how you get there has to be appealing rather than off-putting.
And how do we make sure that it endures? What can we do?
Well, it has to become, people's habits need to change. So there's two types of efficiency that we often think about. One is, just habits every day, turning off the lights, thinking about actions throughout the day. The other one is you want them to invest in improving the infrastructure. Right. So they need to have better insulation, better sealed homes so they don't lose the heated air, the cooled air. That's a one-time decision, or at least it's not a very often made decision. It's something that, maybe every time they replace their furnace, they need to think about a more efficient furnace. But there's those little habits, and then there's those big investment decisions. And we have to think about both of them. And you can use those little habits, things like just replacing a light bulb, to start getting people to think of themselves in a certain way that then may open them up to being, eventually down the road saying, yeah, insulation makes sense. I'm going to invest $2,000 in insulation.
And I think it's illustrative that for the Take Charge Challenge, almost every leadership team decided that the first quarter would be the light bulb challenge. Because that's the thing that's tangible, it's relatively easy to do. There are all kinds, the Boy Scouts can go and hand them out in neighborhoods. There are all kinds of ways to really make that sing. And having then taken that action, it's easier to talk about other actions. The second round, in terms of things that we learned from the first round too, and durable change is, and because we were working with AeroDollars, the second round really focused on whole home retrofits, so that we were working on insulation and sealing ducts and sealing windows and furnaces that were much more efficient and that sort of thing. And two of our utilities started providing on-bill financing, which was huge. So we learned a lot about what actually makes change happen. And as people change their homes where they live, it also does raise that consciousness, particularly if they have a feedback on what they're using when. There really does seem to be some durable change in behaviors in that regard too.
Okay, so to drive the point home, and before we open up to audience questions, the role of messages and messengers and credible facts. Let's hit those three so that we make sure that everybody can retain that part.
For us, clearly, the messenger needed to be the person who had credibility with the people with whom we were trying to work. That wasn't always us, and sometimes it was. But we recruited leadership teams, again, who had, it was always the mayor and the city manager and the superintendent of schools, and then any number of other influential leaders within the community. So messengers matter enormously. And the obvious follow-on to that is the message itself needs to be resonant. It needs to be able to be heard, and critical to that is to avoid the knee-jerk reaction. And so what we learned from the IPCC report was don't ever lead with climate. If people don't agree with us on that, that's okay. We need to be able to find what we can agree on, and we were able to do that. So messages and messengers were absolutely key.
Okay, well, let's raise the lights and let's start getting questions from the audience. We have mics here and here. Don't be shy. The Berkeley audience with no questions, it's just not possible. Oh, here we go.
Have you experienced any pushback from the utilities once consumption went down, in the sense of rates going up, as we've experienced here in Northern California?
We have not experienced pushback from utilities, in part because we've only just begun. And so while reductions were fairly deep in individual communities across an entire service area, they still were very manageable. And so in fact, at the moment, when there are real constraints in terms of adding new generation, utilities, I think, have not been disappointed to have demand dampened somewhat. I would say, I mean, I've actually been thrilled that throughout the economic downturn, when returns for utilities were down in any case, the fact that they continued to robustly support the challenge, really take part and participate, was very rewarding. And I think it goes again to that notion that actually, if customers are demanding it and utilities can see themselves as champions in this, that matters, and they want to hang on to that role.
Do you have plans to address it in the event that it does happen, as I imagine it probably will?
That's a good question. I mean, the challenge, we have yet to see what happens in the next round of that. But if what you mean is if utilities pull back from providing energy efficiency services and/or, yeah, I mean, rates, of course, are going up regardless. And I happen to chair the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board, which is our consumer advocate in the state. And so certainly we're very, very concerned about that, and we'll continue that dialogue with them.
So we have a question over here.
Two questions about your situation in Kansas. First one, with the turbines, do you have a problem with bird kill around the turbines? And the second one is, what's the source of the coal that you use in Kansas? So what states, what areas, what localities, if you could?
Sure. So the answer to the last question first, the source of the coal that is burned in Kansas is the Powder River Basin. And so Montana, Wyoming is where most of our coal comes from. And in terms of bird kill from turbines, there have been several studies, and they're actually ongoing in Kansas with the wind industry. And so certainly there is bird kill. There's no question about that. It's very, very modest in Kansas because most of the migratory birds are not flying at the same height of the turbines. And the wind industry has gotten dramatically better about responsible siting, and so there's a lot of work done in advance of siting those farms to try to stay away from ground nesting birds like prairie chickens and stay out of the flight path of cranes in their migration and so on. So certainly birds are killed, but many, 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 many more are killed by cats in Kansas than are killed by turbines.
Yes, next question.
Two quick questions. Does Kansas have a renewable portfolio standard? And if so, is there a carve out for wind? And given everything that you've said about not talking about climate or not leading with climate, was there any debate about dropping climate from the name of your organization?
That's a great question. Yes, Kansas does have a renewable electricity standard. It was passed actually as a part of the compromise that provided legislative approval for the aforementioned coal plant. Instead of 2,100 megawatts, it went down to 850, and it has not been permitted yet. But part of the agreement to let that coal plant move forward toward potential permitting was a renewable electricity standard. So we do have one. There's not a carve out by wind, or for wind, I should say, but the assumption is that it will be met entirely by wind, and certainly that's what utilities are working on in terms of their assumptions.
Question over here.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that Siemens plant that was mentioned in the video. What specifically they're making, and also how easy was it, or they accepted? It sounded like there was acceptance, but was there any resistance to building the plant? And generally, are there technologies that you're finding resistance to? I mean, anybody resistant to putting in fluorescent voles for whatever reasons?
Sure. Okay. So Dorothy lives in Hutchinson, Kansas, where the Siemens plant is located, and played a role. We at CEP played a small role in getting the factory sited there. And I can say that there was no pushback. In fact, there was universal approbation. The community is thrilled. The state is thrilled. Then Governor Parkinson was a big part of that decision. What's made there are nacelles, and a nacelle is, you could see them in that picture a little bit. They're as big as a bus, but they're what's at the top of behind the turbine. They're the power plant that sits atop that tower. And generates the electricity that's then fed down through the tower. And is there any pushback for other technologies? We did, I will say, during the Take Charge Challenge, we did get a lot of questions about compact fluorescent bulbs and the mercury associated with them. And so that's been a concern that we've addressed, and that actually Walmart was great in many cases about providing safe disposal for. Outside of that, I don't think we have. I don't think we've really had any pushback that's technology specific.
You make this all sound so easy. Is it really that easy?
Is it really that easy? Dot, has it been easy? Yeah.
Good choice of words, breeze.
It's been a breeze. It's
No, but so let me put it this way. So I think some people might think, well, you know, it's to get people to do the easy thing, it's affordable. But you know, if we really want to do something serious about climate change, human-induced climate change, you're going to have to sacrifice. And are these same people willing to really sacrifice, to really feel the hurt if they need to, if it's no longer easy? So I think that's a question that kind of underlies everything. And your answer would be?
We don't know yet. I mean, my answer would be that we start where we can start, and we've made tremendous progress, and we've reduced some little bit of emissions, and I think we've set ourselves up for a policy environment that could dramatically reduce emissions. And again, the atmosphere doesn't care about belief, it cares about the emissions. And so in that regard, I think we've made an important start. And I think that by participating together in that solution, as Eileen said in the video, you almost become a part of something, a part of a movement, a part of a solution. And my conviction is that as that occurs and broadens and deepens, that again, it enables a different kind of conversation over time, and that it takes us to a new platform where we can consider some of the harder things in the future. As that happens, evidence continues to mount. You know, we've had an oppressive drought in the Southwest Power Pool states, in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. And that's got people talking and wondering and thinking. And as that evidence continues, and we are taking action together, we have new prospects that we can't see from here.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't think we cannot do this work. I mean, it requires this cultural change. And this is cultural change in their own terms, right? That's required to get to the place that we need to get, both in terms of policy and individual decisions and business decisions that are being made every day in Kansas and other states. And it has to start somewhere. And so you can't start at this high level, oh, we need this policy throughout the state, we need to force people to do this. People actually we have to think about people and bring them along. They have to be a part of it. And I think the thing that makes your program most successful is it actually puts the local folks as the leaders who get to decide how to do it, how it looks. They're the face of the program, and it's not some outside, top down, like this is what you're going to do.
Right. The ownership is what it's all about, and if you can achieve that, and if those communities really do own those actions and what's behind them, then you have an opportunity to talk about tougher stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Question.
Yes. In Northern California and Oregon, my name's Tom Scott. I'm from Carpenters and Joiners, 713. We've done studies about bats, and horizontal wind turbines seem to influence the bat populations drastically. And I know Kansas is an agricultural state dependent upon production of agricultural goods. So have the people in this group given any thought to re-roofing the homes in Kansas and then strengthening them for tornadoes and seismic difficulties, and then putting solar panels on?
To the first question about roofs, I'm absolutely uncertain about that. What I can say is certainly as a result of the challenge, there's a lot of work that is being done on homes to just tighten their envelope and to make them more energy efficient. And to the bat question, we do have bat populations in Kansas. They're very localized. And so we have had far fewer bat problems just because of the landscape and the habitat that we have than many other states have.
Well, the other in conjunction of this is, has Siemens investigated producing smaller V8 WTs instead of horizontal wind turbines?
To my knowledge, no, and certainly not in this location. What they're focused upon is, Siemens has a conviction that that wind corridor, sort of, from North Dakota on down through Texas Panhandle, is going to be very well developed, and so they want to be near that development for the big turbines.
Yes, next question.
As you can tell, I was in Kansas for a while. I was at KU for grad school studying evolutionary biology, which was interesting there in the 2000s. And I got involved through that with Kansas Citizens for Science, and now I work at the National Center for Science Education here in Oakland, defending evolution. So I'm curious, and we're seeing a lot of similarities between what happens around evolution education and around climate education. I'm curious if you could talk more about, was there resistance in the schools to, well, one, how is climate talked about in Kansas schools? I haven't really kept track of that. And is there resistance, and to what extent are the community sorts of things that you're doing, does that ameliorate some of the concerns that people might have about what's happening in the schools? And then a sort of related question of, are there things that you're finding are particularly effective at reaching students to get them over roadblocks that they might have to climate literacy, either through the sorts of programs you're doing or other things that you've just come across?
Okay, those are good questions. And I think here's a failure.
A failure?
Jeff really wanted me to talk about failures, and so you've given me that opportunity, and I appreciate that.
She didn't want to talk about failures.
Yeah, no, I don't love talking about failure, but it's an opportunity. The schools, well, first, the work that we've done on efficiency and wind has helped us to talk about all kinds of things, including and especially a resilient energy future. It has not at this point really opened an opportunity to talk about climate because we still have such a long way to go on the efficiency and the wind piece, and we really want to focus on that while it's successful. I would say that in the bulk of Kansas schools, climate is not discussed much still, if at all. And the failure, we were working with an organization that does work with Kansas schools, and we had really hoped to have a dialogue that would simply present various points of view on climate change and then give participants an opportunity to discuss. And that was not possible. And so climate change itself remains very, very divisive. And to the question someone asked earlier about the Climate and Energy Project and whether that name, whether we ever gave thought to that, we thought about it a lot. We thought about changing the name a great deal, but we have done so much in the state, and we've developed so many good partnerships that we hate to walk away from that. So we're sticking with it, and it keeps us honest.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, California has been working on energy efficiency for, I don't know, quite a long time. So when we track the usage across the state of power, right, California has basically stayed flat, although the population's gone up. Almost the rest of the U.S. just keeps growing.
Right.
So what are you tracking in Kansas, and how big is the program? Sounds like it's just a few communities at this point. So what are you seeing overall?
Right. The part of the mission here was to recruit and support, to nurture champions throughout the state of Kansas who would help us to a different policy future. California has benefited from good policy for quite some time, and we don't have a lot of that policy. We don't have any of that policy in place. And so what we now have, you're exactly right. The first round of the Take Charge Challenge was 6 communities. This round has been 16 communities. And so we've been building the capacity, the visibility to have a different discussion across the state in terms of our policy future. In terms of what we're tracking, we've been able to track the reductions and the measures taken in these communities during the time of the challenge, but we're not in a position to track those communities over time. I wish that we were, and I wish that that was a capacity that we did have. And so, and again, we can't really talk about a statewide reduction. We can talk about very localized reductions. And so the challenge now for us is to figure out, how do we scale this? How do we take what we've learned and talk with the Kansas Corporation Commission about what's been successful in other states, and whether, given our successes, we have demonstrated enough demand to say, hey, let's provide some different programs than we've had in the past.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi.
Hi.
Congratulations on all your successes.
Thank you.
Here in California, we have a disconnect between when we have a demand for energy and when the wind blows.
Yeah.
And I want to know if you have a similar disconnect in Kansas, and if you do, is that driving you toward moving from energy efficiency to more demand response?
Excellent question, and the answer is, to a large extent, yes and yes. So the profile of the Kansas wind is that it does tend to blow disproportionately at night. That's what we have always said. However, numerous wind developers have recently told me that I should never say that anymore, because in fact, in many of our wind farm sites, we are seeing much more diverse wind profile and even a lot of on-peak delivery. So, but in general, we are often off-peak. And so, yes, there is a real focus on how we move to demand response in addition to the energy efficiency broadly conceived.
I need to ask you to share that one story about when you were looking for credible sources of facts, and it's the Kansas State, I think, no, you used was NOAA versus Kansas State measurement. Could you pass on, this is a really good anecdote for how you work with an audience that is somewhat skeptical of sources of information.
Mm-hmm. So I was sitting at a luncheon with a bunch of agricultural producers, and there was an argument that happened about climate change, and I was just sitting there not talking. I was listening. And one of the people said that there was no evidence that climate change was happening. One of them said, actually, the climate's cooling, and one of them said something else similar. And so finally, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I said, you know what, you guys, I'm just curious, what's your data? What's your data for these claims? And we talked it through, and one of them said, well, it's the weather people. And I said, well, which weather?
The weather people?
The weather people. Which weather people?
From the 60s, no.
Yeah, the other underground people. The weather people, and meaning meteorologists. And so it was a great opportunity to say, well, actually, the American Meteorological Society has said incontrovertibly that the climate is changing and it is in fact warming. And so we kind of went from there, and when they said what source was credible, I was able to reply with the fact about that, and that really made a difference. And specifically, rather than talking about the IPCC with this group, which would have been utterly not persuasive, as I already knew, what I was able to do was say, look, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which runs the National Weather Service, which farmers listen to every day, the National Weather Service tells them what they are doing that day. And so that's a highly credible source. And so we were able to talk about that and say, there's plenty of data here. This really isn't controversial. What's happening is beyond dispute. And you can go home and you can look it up, and here's where it is. And it was a wonderful conversation, because at the end of it, they said, you know what, I'm going to go home and do that. Thanks. That was helpful. And so totally different conversation than when we were passing out, the UN's very authoritative report.
So the question from this gentleman. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see one. I apologize. Yeah, go, please.
Yeah, you've been doing a tremendously brilliant job. How can it be multiplied to other states? Because I'm not American. I come from Europe. And I can tell you, from my little state, we have created 50,000 good jobs in wind and bio. So when you're coming from an agricultural state like Kansas, why not go for further goals? So you had this quarter, 2030, still coal, net should be replaced with bio from the farming to the utilities. So replace that dirty coal. There are so many possibilities, so just go for it, and I hope that it can be multiplied in other states.
Thank you, we'll try.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience, and then we're going to have some closing remarks. Did you want to? We'll have two. We'll take one short one since you've asked before.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been a big discussion of climate change, right? From a very, very different framing, which is because Kansas is so agricultural, they see it, right? I mean, there's been lots of change happening on the farms, right, from growing seasons and droughts and what have you. So has anybody tried to frame it more from that view rather than, you know, the discussions that we have here, right, which is global warming,
Sure.
right? It's just very local effects again on what people see.
Sure, so a couple of things. I mean, we commissioned a study early on in our work by the University of Kansas. So we had local scientists who looked at Kansas impacts of climate change. And they were talking about things like impacts of, you know, for weight gain for cattle and pests, crop pests, and all of those sorts of things. And so that was something that we put out fairly early. And that got a fairly good reception. Shortly after that, Kansas State University, which is our land-grant university and much more highly credible in most of Kansas than the University of Kansas, where I am, released a study that was a wonderful longitudinal study on temperatures in Kansas that they've been monitoring for well over 100 years. And again, the evidence was clear. And so certainly there is a growing sense of what's happening, and anecdotally when we talk with Kansans, lots and lots of them. We did some focus groups very early, and the trajectory of that conversation tended to be beginning with, no, nothing's really happening. And then they themselves, we weren't participating, we were observing, and it was neutrally facilitated, and they talked themselves around to, well, something's happening. And, you know, growing seasons are changing, we're planting at different times, we're not getting rain at the right times. But somebody then would say, it's not human caused. And then they would kind of go around and say, well, maybe not, but clearly what we're doing isn't helping. I mean, there's some bad things going on. We're putting a lot of stuff up in the atmosphere. And then somebody would say, but we can't possibly afford to fix it. And then they would finally work their way around to, well, but we should do what we can. And that was really the inspiration for a lot of what we did, because again, the common sense is, you may not know, you heard the guy on the film, and a lot of Kansans would say to you, well, sure, something's happening, but we don't know what the cause is, and we don't really know how to fix it. But if the response is, okay, but if we recognize a risk, how can we manage that risk? And let's just do everything we can that we can afford to do and move on down the road. And that makes sense to everybody. And so that's really been our approach.
Okay, do you have one last question?
So back to the challenge, I'm wondering, how do you start a challenge? Sort of what is the key to getting people involved?
Mm-hmm. In our case, it started with Dorothy and I, to meet with, we called and said, could we meet with the mayor, and could the mayor bring the city manager? And we fully expected that they would say, that's nice, ladies, we don't really want to talk to you. But they all took our meetings, and then we expected they would say, that sounds great, but it sounds like too much work for us, so we don't want to do it. But every one of them said yes. So, you know, we went to mayors and city managers to start, and then we asked them to help us think through who the leadership team should be. And we mentioned that we'd love to have the superintendent of schools or a principal that was beloved by the community, that we'd love to have, if there's a medical center, a hospital, somebody from there involved. Some of the big energy users involved. The Chamber of Commerce, always, we wanted to have involved. And the mayor and the city manager then personally invited that key core leadership team. We held facilitation meetings. You saw one of them with Dorothy with a flip chart. and then they enlarged that leadership group and came up with, we helped them through, we want to do quarterly challenges. Here's the spectrum of what's worked best in communities across the country. Mm-hmm. And you could try any of those things, and you tell us how you want to do it. And so we then worked with them from there. They had monthly leadership team lunches. That was one of our costs. We thought that if we fed them, they would like to come, and they did. And then they planned all their events, and we just helped.
Okay. So Merrian, final thoughts for the audience. What would be the takeaway message you want to leave with these folks who are still seated here?
Gosh. In terms of what really works, I think that we might start with things like it's going to save you money, but if we only use that, we're never going to get as far as we need to go.
Okay.
In terms of the problems that we have, in terms of climate, environment, et cetera. But the larger values that we attach that to can be multiple things. And I really wonder about pushing climate change in a place that there's so much polarization around that specific topic that you can waste a lot of time and energy and money just defending your position as opposed to moving people towards something positive that they could probably connect to even without climate change at a larger level.
Okay. And Nancy, for any aspiring Nancy Jacksons who might be in the audience or watching this ultimately on YouTube, any words of advice?
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid and never take no for an answer. It's possible to do incredible, amazing things with a tiny group of inspired people. And that's the other thing, work with brilliant people.
I second that. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Merrian. Thank you, audience. Thank you for attending Science Theater, and see you again on November 7th.